Hello and welcome to today's webinar on tips for interviewing relatives. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Vice President of Education and Programming here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm going to be your moderator and virtual MC for today's program. American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. I do want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. And today, especially, at least kind of in the Massachusetts, New England area, we've come under a lot of snowfall. So we're hoping that our at-home internet connections stay strong through the next hour. So we do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. If we were to lose connection for any reason, not to worry, you will still have access to a full recording for free on our website as well as our YouTube channel. So giving today's presentation is Stephanie Call, Associate Director of Archives and Education at the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center here at NEHGS. Stephanie has been with the organization since 2007 and is responsible for overseeing the JHC's archival collections, creating educational programming and content, and conducting outreach. Stephanie received a BA in English and Jewish Studies from Mount Holyoke College and an MS in Library and Information Science with a concentration in Archives Management from Simmons College. She is also a member of the Society of American Archivists and the New England Archivists. So now, at some point, probably in everyone's life, there's a moment where we regret not having asked our parents or grandparents something when we had the chance. And an oral history interview can really be just as important to our family history research as document-based research. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we'll discuss how to plan your project, what are the steps taken for a successful interview, and also how to preserve your audio files and handwritten notes once the interview is completed. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is a syllabus for this session that can be purchased from our online bookstore. You'll find a link to this downloadable PDF in your reminder emails, as well as in your follow-up email after today's broadcast. And as I mentioned, we are recording this, so you can always go back and watch, rewatch, pause, rewind, fast forward, any of the content that we're discussing today for free on our website and our YouTube channel. So again, if you miss something, not to worry, you can always have a chance to go back and review it. All right, so without further ado, I will now turn things over to Stephanie.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Interviewing your relatives is certainly a worthy endeavor, particularly during this time that we're living in, and I'm pleased to be here with all of you today to give you some tips and pointers for talking to your relatives about their family and personal histories. And certainly, I think the way to consider an interview with a relative is to consider it as a project. And as with any project, it's best to start with a plan. This plan should include a variety of components, including the names of the people you want to interview and who they are. Are they your cousins, your siblings, your parents, aunts, or uncles? What do you want to know? Is it biographical information, family history stories, or are you looking for stories about a particular time, event, or place? And what research should you do in advance? If you want to know more about a relative's childhood in a certain town, or maybe their experience in the 1960s New York City advertising world, you do want to do some research in advance to prepare relevant questions. Also, how will you interview them? Although meeting in person is not the best option for us right now, we do have plenty of remote options available through the magic of technology, and chances are after months of most gatherings happening online, people are more comfortable with these technical options. How can you make your narrators comfortable with this process? And what will you do with the information? Are you using this information for any specific purpose, and what is that purpose? And finally, how will you preserve these interviews? So I'll go through all of these as separate steps, but you will find that many of these steps are going to overlap when it comes to actually doing this process. But certainly, I hope that talking about them this way will provide some clarity. So although we're not talking about formal oral history projects today, there are still some principles of practice that everyone should apply to interviewing relatives. These are from the Oral History Association, and you can read more about these principles on their website, which is on this slide here. You, of course, always want to respect your narrators, and when I refer to narrators, I'm talking about your interviewees, by honoring their communities, their perspectives, and their stories. Always be transparent throughout the entire process, from scheduling the interview with your relative to creating that final product and enabling access to that product. You always want to have the narrator's consent for all of those pieces and parts. There can also be power differentials between the interviewer and the narrators. So these are dynamics that you want to be sensitive to as you develop your questions and schedule a time to meet with your relative. Of course, you always want to protect your narrators by ensuring that they have an opportunity to review and restrict content that they aren't comfortable with sharing. And always remember that they own their words, you don't. Of course, preserve the process and the product. And finally, be ethical. Your narrators always need to be informed about your intentions with these interviews, whether it's just for general family history research or you plan to publish it in some way, shape, or form. So the first step is to decide who you want to interview. When we think about interviewing our relatives, we often think about interviewing relatives who are older than we are, which is absolutely something we should do. But don't discount relatives who are your contemporaries or even younger than you. If you have adult nieces or nephews, as an example, they could have some really interesting stories to tell about growing up in your sibling's home. They might also have stories of their own to share about your parents, their grandparents, and might appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of those family stories. And of course, the same argument can be applied to your own adult children if you're a parent. And there is a certain order to this list as I'm showing it to you here. And that's really in priority of who you should talk to first. It's, of course, best to start with your oldest relatives or any relatives that have serious health issues or memory loss, as those are the most imperative stories to collect first. So how do you ask your relatives to participate in an interview? Well, of course, if you know them well, you can just ask them. Tell them why this is important to you, why their story is important to your project overall. And I'll talk a little bit more in a bit about informing your narrators about the scope of your project and intent. If you don't know a relative as well, and you do want to interview them, you can ask a mutually known relative for an introduction. Maybe they can drop an email introducing you, or they can call this relative before you reach out to them personally. And if you do decide to just send a sort of cold call email or an actual cold call, that works fine as long as you outline how you're related. Or maybe you can ask the mutually known relative if you can just kind of drop their name in that call or email. You always just want to be direct about what you're looking for, the time commitment, and what you'll be doing with the interviews at the end of the process. So after you decide who to interview, then you need to think about what you want to know. This includes defining the scope of the interview and doing some research on the subject of your interview in advance. You then want to consider your questions. So here you can go in a couple of different directions. For more straightforward interviews, creating a set of well-defined questions in advance is perfectly fine. However, a question outline will give you some more flexibility in asking questions, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. You might also want to identify any photographs or documents, ephemera, or heirlooms that could help prompt your narrator, or that maybe you want more information about as well. Think of the scope of the interview as a statement of purpose. Why are you doing this interview? And why have you chosen to interview this person? Is there a specific topic or a time period that you want the interview to cover? Identifying these ideas in advance help you narrow down what research you do prior to the interview. So here are some ideas of themes. You could interview relatives that lived through a specific event, like Watergate, or an era like the 1960s. You could interview relatives who are all first-generation immigrants or war veterans, or interview relatives who hold the key to old family recipes. If you're doing more straight shot interviews with relatives about their lives, more of a biographical scope, there's certainly plenty you can ask about. But some general ideas are asking about their childhood, their young adulthood, marriage or partnerships and children or not, their career, and maybe any hobbies they have. As an example, if you know someone really loves watching baseball games, they might have a story to tell about how they cultivated that love for the game by going to games with a grandparent. Now, you might be wondering why I'm suggesting you do some research. After all, you're asking questions to find out about something. But doing research does help you write targeted questions. And here's an example. If you want to interview your uncle who served in the Korean War, but you don't really know anything about the Korean War, your questions will end up being vague or just maybe not the right questions to ask. So you would want to read up on the Korean War before coming up with questions. Look into why the US entered the war, what battles the troops fought in, and what troops were involved in the war overall. You can also create a biographical form for relatives to fill out before you formulate your questions. This form could ask the narrator to put down simple dates and names of their immediate family members. It could provide information on whether they're a war vet and with what branch or unit. They could put some work experience on that form and places that they lived previously. Any information that might point you in the direction of something that you need to research more. Researching ensures that you can outline the scope of your project, prepare thoughtful questions or an outline of topics to discuss, and also be prepared during the interview to ask important follow-up questions that might help clarify the narrator's story. For genealogical purposes, research can also help you, the interviewer, identify the information that you simply don't know. A few examples of this might be an ancestor that was seemingly born in 2 different countries, determining that major age differences between children in the same family are due to 2 different marriages, or maybe just trying to figure out why an ancestor seems to drop off the historical record. And you always want to utilize both primary and secondary sources in your research. So let's quickly review what some of those are. A good rule of thumb to remember is that primary source materials provide first-hand evidence of an event, person, place, or object. Secondary sources are published materials that utilize primary source materials. Primary sources are found in archives, and they can include correspondence, newspapers, diaries, vital records, deeds, legal documents, photographs, scrapbooks, interviews, speeches, and yes, oral histories. Secondary sources include books, newspapers, articles, reference books, bibliographies, and indexes. So you might see I have newspapers listed as both primary and secondary sources. That's because a newspaper article can be a primary source if it's published at the time of the event. but it's a secondary source if it's written after the event occurs. Newspaper articles written about D-Day on the day of or the next day are primary sources, but articles written on, say, the 10th anniversary are secondary. And just my helpful reminder that your family history doesn't exist in a vacuum. What we see now as history indelibly marked your family in some way, and to understand why your family made the choices they made, you do need to understand the historical context of the times they lived in. So once you do your research, you can begin to craft your questions, which you do want to do before the interview takes place. I want to caution you, however, on providing the questions to your narrator in advance. You do get more honest reactions and responses if you don't send the questions in advance. If a narrator is uncomfortable answering something, they can always decline and say that they're not comfortable. While I don't recommend sharing your questions in advance, you can share a question outline in advance. So here are some sample questions that you can ask a relative, and all of these are depending, of course, on who this relative is. But say your relative tells you that the Challenger explosion is the biggest historical event from their childhood. Your prior research about what happened in the 1980s might help you ask some additional questions. You might want to know how they witnessed it. Did they see it on TV, or did someone tell them about it? Some other questions you might want to ask are about the relative's parents, why they decided to do what they did as a career, or maybe their career was chosen for them, and why they decided to enlist in a particular branch of the military. Another technique you can utilize is the question outline, which I've mentioned. So a question outline doesn't delineate questions, but it focuses on topics and themes that you might want to get at in an interview. So this example is a question outline that I did for an oral history project with my mother many years ago. I wanted to focus on the background of her family, my great-grandparents who were Orthodox Jews that immigrated from Eastern Europe, my grandparents who started the Christmas traditions that my mother so enjoyed, and what New Haven, Connecticut was like in the 1940s. Anti-Semitism was also a major theme that I wanted to address, and I wanted to have a much clearer understanding of how this impacted my mother's Jewish identity. When my mom was a young teen, her family moved out of the city of New Haven to the suburb of Westport, Connecticut, and this was a very different community than what my mom knew, and she was no longer near her extended family. So this also impacted her identity growing up. And then finally, I wanted to focus on what the outcome of this sort of Jewish identity crisis was. My father wasn't Jewish. My brothers and I were raised with very little understanding of our Jewish heritage. But in the last years of my dad's life and afterwards, my mother started to explore her heritage more openly because she worked at a synagogue. So these were all ideas and themes that I wanted to explore with her during this interview process. However you determine your questions, when you ask them, you want to avoid questions that are only going to give you a yes or no answer. So this does require some thought and planning. You want to avoid questions like, did you like college? Because someone might answer you with, yeah, I liked it enough, or no, I didn't like it at all. So if you know someone went to college and you're trying to get more information about that time period, you could ask, what classes did you enjoy most in college? Or why did you choose to go to that college? And then you can ask appropriate follow-up questions. Follow-up questions might not be something that you planned, but it does indicate that you're actively listening. So if they say, I liked my astronomy class, you might want to ask why, and maybe ask what classes they didn't like. You also don't want to lead your narrator in a certain direction or say something like, I assumed you liked biology because they were a doctor. that could certainly be a safe assumption. But the class that they really enjoyed might have been Southern literature, which might make for a really interesting discussion and give you a little more insight into your relative. Here are some examples of generally phrased follow-up questions to ask your narrator if you need to. When did that happen? Did that happen to you? What did you think about that? Can you give me an example? And what happened after that? These are really good basic follow-up questions that can be used for almost any answer you get that needs a little bit more information. So other important interview etiquette to mention. This is a really important one. Don't share your opinions about something during the interview. If you disagree with a political statement your narrator makes, this is not your opportunity to say so. The interview is your narrator's time to share their story, and it's going to include their biases and opinions. This may be really difficult in a family interview because you might already have an existing rapport with that family member that you're interviewing. And it can be sometimes challenging to remove yourself from that process. Stories are subjective and they're mostly based on our memories, which sometimes can be a little faulty. People can also remember the same event differently. If you ask siblings the same questions, you'll most likely get variations in their responses. And this is especially true around traumatic events. So if someone asked me what the first historical event of my childhood was that I could remember, I'm the person that would say it was the Challenger explosion in 1986. What I remember is that it was a snow day, kind of like today. I was at my best friend's house and we were in her basement and we saw this happen live on TV. And I was in the 3rd grade at the time. So all of that could be true, and it's true as far as I know, but my childhood best friend might remember it completely differently. The reason for this is what experts call flashbulb memories, and these are memories that are formed during highly volatile and emotional moments. Researchers who studied people's responses to events like the Challenger explosion and later 9/11 realize that the same people will have different memories of what happened shortly after it happened versus a year later. But what stays the same is their conviction that their memory is accurate. Offering your opinions or debating different memories will most certainly shut your narrator down or get you completely off track. You can certainly ask clarifying questions, but you always want to keep your narrator engaged. You might also hear things that you don't want to hear, that you're not ready to hear, or that someone else shouldn't hear. So just be prepared that some of those conversations could happen. And this does go back to the idea of oral history interviews as a primary source that needs to be evaluated for biases and influences if being used in research. If you feel like, and especially with interviewing family members, that there might be some difficulty interviewing that particular family member for you, you can enlist the help of someone to do the interview for you. I once interviewed my friend's mom because she felt that she would insert herself a little bit into the interview. And this is perfectly acceptable. And it could be a good way of giving your narrator the space to answer questions without feeling concerned about how you might feel about the answer. So essentially, you do want to do your best to remain neutral. On another note, since people do like to talk with their hands, they might demonstrate the size of something or the height of something, or even say my dress was the same color as the couch you're sitting on. So certainly this is really more for audio interviews, and you as the interviewer would need to clarify those statements. And this is where a yes or no question would be okay. So as an example, if the narrator says, I was about yay big at the time, and they're holding their hand parallel to the floor about 4 feet up, you as the interviewer can say, so you were about 4 feet tall at the time. Or if the narrator says, my dress was the same color as the couch you're sitting on, you can ask, the dress was a pale blue color, just as a way to clarify those things. So here's a quick cheat sheet on the do's and don'ts of question asking. You do want to ask open-ended questions. You want to ask follow-up questions for more information. Clarify jargon and acronyms. It's going to be very confusing if your aunt is discussing her career at the CIA and she means the Culinary Institute of America and not the Central Intelligence Agency. Get details. If someone mentions a person, place, or event that you don't know a lot about, it's okay to ask for more information. Who was Cousin Sal? Or why did you go to Pasadena? When did Grandma and Grandpa get married? Summarize. This means reviewing something that your narrator previously said, but asking for more information. As an example, you could say, you said this didn't have any other experiences with anti-Semitism, but recalled this particular incident. What did you think about that? And ask one question at a time. So sometimes we tend to pepper people with more than one question. I'm somebody who does this all the time, and we don't let them answer the first question we asked. This would sound something like, when did you start celebrating Christmas? How did your grandparents feel about this? Did that ever give your parents pause about what they were doing? It doesn't help your narrator know what you're looking for, and chances are they're only going to retain that last question, and that's the one they'll answer. So keep it to, when did you start celebrating Christmas? And wait for the answer. So things not to do, of course, you don't want to ask leading questions. Don't ask questions that relate to your own biases. This can happen often when you're asking questions about politics or wars, or even who makes a better roast chicken in the family. Try to keep your own feelings out of it. And again, don't assume anything, as you are most likely very wrong. One way to engage your narrator is through props like family heirlooms, photographs, letters, or other documents like family trees. Have a piece of your mother's wedding china. You can use it to ask stories about your parents' wedding. What about that mystery man in the 1935 photograph of your grandparents? That could be that cousin Sal. Perhaps a relative knows who that man was and why he was in the photo. Letters, postcards, photographs, and ephemera like ticket stubs and programs are all excellent launching points for asking questions. And this, of course, is especially useful in biographical interviews if you're trying to figure out who is in that old photo or the story behind a letter you found in some boxes in the attic. If you are audio recording your interviews and using props, it's helpful for any notes, or if you do a transcript afterwards, to identify what you and the narrator are looking at. The narrator, of course, can do most of this identification, especially if they have a lot of information on that item. When you have your narrators and questions lined up, you need to decide how you will interview them. So I suppose one silver lining of our current pandemic situation is that many more people have become comfortable with technology, which might not have been the case a few months ago. And this really opens the possibilities for how you can interview your relatives. Some options for online video platforms are now the ubiquitous Zoom, Skype, and Google Meet, which was formerly Google Hangout. Any user on Zoom can record, and you can record to the cloud or to your local machine. You can also easily record with Skype, which saves your recording for 30 days, and you can download it at any point. Google Meet is a little bit different. From what I understand, you need a G Suite Enterprise level account to record on Google Meet, and then only the organizer of the call can record it. It is, however, saved to your Google Drive. Many of us have iPhones and FaceTime, although even though this is a phone app, it only records video and not audio. If you have a MacBook, you can purchase software called Ecamm Call Recorder for FaceTime, and that will record the audio. And so what are some other ways to record information from a relative? If you have a very camera-shy relative, you can certainly do this over email. And again, meeting in person right now is not recommended, but if you are able to safely, you can use an audio recorder or a video recorder as well. Before we start talking about other logistics, a note about time. This is absolutely something that you should schedule in advance with your narrator and make sure you schedule enough time to do the interview. That being said, also pay attention to signs that the narrator is getting tired or distracted, especially older relatives, and plan to schedule a follow-up interview if you have more questions. For audio and video recordings, if you're interviewing someone online or via FaceTime, you also need to pay close attention to lighting and sound for both you and your narrator. So many of us have sat through numerous Zoom meetings where the dog starts barking, the cat jumps in front of the camera, the lighting puts your colleagues in shadow and you can't see them. You might have emergency vehicles driving past your house with their sirens blasting, and people on the call can hear all of this despite your headphones. Some of these interruptions or other challenges can't quite be avoided. However, you can set up your home space and help your narrator set up their space with a little work in advance. First of all, as with any conversation, you want to be comfortable and you want your narrator to be comfortable as well. Make sure you both have a glass of water handy. And although it's tempting to maybe meet for a virtual tea to make this a little more fun, you might want to refrain from eating during the interview. If you're using Zoom or a similar product, it helps to do a sound test and a video test before you hop on your call, and you want your narrator to do the same thing. And then when you're both on the call, take a moment to do a quick check of your sound and test the recording as well. Now, regarding Zoom or other online platforms, something to keep in mind is that not all computers have built-in microphones or cameras. So you also want to check with your narrator when you're interviewing, before you interview them. Make sure that they have a camera, make sure they have a mic and a headset or earbuds. These are things that we take for granted until the moment of truth arrives, and you might be able to see your aunt on screen, but you can't hear her, or vice versa. And of course, try to schedule your call for a time when you and your narrator will have minimal household interruptions, things that can be controlled as opposed to traffic noises from outside. And lastly, lighting. When you're recording video or on a video call with someone and it's being recorded, you do want to be able to see their face and vice versa. So lighting sources should be in front of the person facing the camera. Much has been made about ring lights, but not everybody has them. So you would want to at least test some options out, depending on the time of day when you're interviewing someone. Windows during the daytime do offer good natural light, but again, it depends on placement. And certainly during the nighttime, you do want lights in front of the person facing the camera. Lighting in the evening can definitely cause a lot of weird and wobbly things going on. So definitely something to check. So when you begin to interview someone, you do want to start with an opening statement that you, the interviewer, will say. And this statement should include your name, your narrator's name, the date of the interview, the location of the interview, and a brief purpose statement. As an example, you might say something like, this interview is conducted by Susie Q on August 25th, 2020 at our respective homes. You could give the addresses if you want. This interview is recorded on Zoom. Aunt Nancy will be helping to fill in some blanks on our family tree. And what this does is provide context and placement for your interview. When you conclude an interview, just like when you start one, you want a closing statement. And in this closing statement, you also want to take a moment to thank your narrator and express an appreciation for their time and willingness to share their story. So here's an example of what you can say. Again, it can just be very brief. This concludes Susie Q's interview with Nancy B on August 25th, 2020. Aunt Nancy, thank you so much for spending time with me this afternoon and helping with this project. You might also want to consider taking a photo or a screenshot of your screen with the narrator, and take your time putting your files away, saving them, making sure you label things as needed. And when you're able to, make a copy of the interview to give to the narrator with a thank you note. And you might also want to fill out an information form that documents the interview. An interview information form might include some of the following: the date, the narrator name and address, your name and address, the location of the interview, how it was recorded, the length and number of interviews, what subjects you covered, and whether a consent or release form was signed. And you can file this information along with any correspondence or photos, your research, your questions, and any other forms that you might have in a master file for each narrator. So although your relatives might be perfectly happy to share their stories, it might also feel very daunting to them. Or some of them might feel like their stories aren't very interesting or important. So how can you make your narrators feel more comfortable with this process? Once your relative agrees to an interview, you might want to have a pre-meeting to talk about the process and the scope of the interview. And if you do plan to use the interview for any purpose outside of a family newsletter or reunion, you might want to talk about what their rights are, including access restrictions, copyright, and expected use of the interview. This is also a good time to talk about any forms you might need them to fill out. If you did put together a biographical form for them, or you plan to donate these interviews to an archive and you need consent forms signed, this is definitely a good time to talk about what those forms are and what you need from them. And this is also a really great opportunity to practice with your technology, especially if you're doing this online. How do you record it? Where does the recording get saved? Do your relatives' camera and mic work? Do yours work? What are they having trouble with? This way you can get some of those issues resolved before your actual interview. During the interview, there's some tried and true methods for making your narrator more comfortable. Listen carefully and try not to interrupt unless something is very unclear. On video platforms, you aren't able to use body language so much to encourage your narrator to continue, but you should still try to minimize verbal cues. I think all of us are a little bit afraid of silence and sitting in silence with someone. And on video platforms, this can be especially unnerving because you don't know if they're just thinking about their answer or if they've frozen, right? If their internet connection hasn't been helpful. So just give it a moment before you ask that dreaded question, am I frozen or can you hear me? Keep to what the narrator knows. Don't ask them about events, people, or places that they wouldn't know about. You might also want to keep a list of proper names and place names that they mentioned for afterwards that you can ask the narrator, how to spell them and keep that in their file. And definitely manage your time. I recommend really no longer than an hour for the interview, especially in sort of these online formats, which sometimes, they feel a little more daunting, probably because it's harder for us to read people's body language and nonverbal cues. People might be very reluctant to be interviewed as well. You could have people say something similar to, my story isn't unique, or you should interview your uncle, he loves to talk, or I'm not sure I'd be comfortable talking into a microphone or on video, or I have nothing important to say. You want to encourage these reluctant narrators to share their stories by explaining to them why their voice matters in your family history interviews. These reasons will be unique to your project and to your narrators, but certainly keep in mind if they're very reluctant and really don't want to be interviewed, don't twist their arm to get them to do it. I will say, though, that people who are eager or who will at least tolerate the idea of sharing their stories might still have some trouble during the actual interview. So just try to peg into their style. Are they someone that does need some time to sit with a question and think about it before they answer? Make sure you give them that time. Again, don't be afraid to sit with them in silence. And typically it's recommended that you interview only one person at a time. That's certainly true with formal oral history projects. But for this, you might have some instances where a relative will only consent to doing an interview if somebody else could be with them during the interview. And if that's the case, work with what you have. So aside from recording one-on-one interviews, what are some other ways for you to engage with a reluctant narrator? You can certainly ask if they'd be more comfortable responding to questions in writing and email them the questions you would like to know the answers to. You could work with them on filling out some components of your family tree. Once they get engaged in that project, they might start telling you family stories as you put together those names and dates. So if there's a way to do that online, sharing your screen in Zoom, and you can record that conversation, even better. And if you have a particularly entertaining storyteller in the family, you could certainly do an online event and invite other family members to hear these stories. Certainly some people are very shy about being recorded, but others do benefit from having an audience. So I'd strongly suggest if you do that you would be the only person asking the questions, you would be the moderator, but you can open your online chat for other family members to, submit questions as well. And at this point, I do want to remind you all that it's not about you. It's easy to get carried away and start talking about ourselves during these interviews, especially if your narrator says something that you can relate to or you have a story about yourself. You can certainly say that you had a similar experience, but your narrator is your subject, not the other way around. So don't make the conversation about you. Earlier, I mentioned thinking about what you'll do with the information from these interviews. So here are some possibilities. You might just be doing this for your own purposes and the interviews will never be seen or heard by anyone else. That's probably very unlikely though. You at least will maybe be sharing it with family members. Or you might be considering donating the interviews to an archive, or you might use it in some sort of published material like an article or a book. Whatever your reason is, you need to share it with your narrator before the interview takes place. Someone could be perfectly fine being interviewed just for your purposes or to share with the family, but they might absolutely not want these stories shared publicly. And for an archive or for a publisher, it's really important for them to know that these interviews were given freely and with the knowledge that they would be either donated to an archive or published. And so this is where informed consent comes into play. This means that your narrator is informed by you, the interviewer, of the interview's purpose, the narrator's rights, and that anything they want kept confidential will remain confidential. If you're considering donating them to an archive does greatly appreciate narrators signing a consent and release form. You can find examples of this online, or if the archive has an oral history policy, it might have something similar. Whether you choose to donate to an archive or not, as an archivist, I can't let this webinar end without briefly touching on preservation of these interviews. As you create your video recordings or your audio recordings of your interviews, you do need to think about organization and preservation. Once you transfer your interviews to your computer, consider organization, specifically how you name your files, your folder structure, and metadata. Once you have a digital file you want to preserve, you immediately need to save it in a preservation format. And then you need to build a schedule of backing up your work and checking in with your work. When you transfer your files to your computer or another storage device, you want to make sure that you create and stick with a naming convention that will tell you and others what the content of the file is. So you want to make sure it's something simple but descriptive. So here are a couple of examples. You have the narrator last name, first initial, middle initial, date of interview, or the narrator last name, first name, and date of interview. Your file names will obviously depend on the names of your narrators. But you might also want to consider creating folders with the narrator's name to house all of those digital files pertaining to that interview. And then, of course, you do want to add metadata. Metadata is data about data. It's another way to help find your digital records, and it essentially means words used to describe an item. All born digital items do have basic metadata that's automatically created when you for a Zoom recording, you have metadata that's sort of attached to it automatically. And anytime you open that file and save it, that metadata will change. That's called technical metadata. And it's basically a part of every audio and video file you create. The user, who is you, can add descriptive metadata, which does help someone know what is in the file. And you can add this through any audio or video editing software. And you can also create a separate electronic file with descriptive information for each interview. Metadata can be complicated for oral history recordings or interviews. So if you have a repository in mind for donating any interviews, they can also advise you on how to ensure that descriptive information for each interview is provided to them. So that way, all you need to focus on is storage and preservation until such time the interviews are donated to an archive. You also want to make sure you transfer all unedited audio and video recordings to your computer hard drive as soon as possible, and that your computer has the memory and storage capacity to handle these files, which can be quite large. You, of course, should back up your hard drive frequently and save unedited sound video files to no fewer than 2 additional locations. Some recommendations say at least 4 locations. Possible storage mechanisms for your interviews are cloud services like Google Drive or iCloud, or external storage like an external hard drive seen here or USB, and optical media like CDs or DVDs. And what you want to absolutely keep in mind is this acronym, LOCKS, lots of copies, keeps stuff safe. If one copy of an interview is corrupted, you'll have another, and you'll have the convenience of a local copy saved on your computer, let's say, with the security of possible geographic distribution. That means if you save it in the cloud somewhere, it's saved on another server elsewhere. You do need to, of course, sync and monitor multiple systems that you're using for backup, which can add to an additional cost. But essentially, you always want to save your files to at least 2 different locations, like an external hard drive and the cloud, as an example. Here's just a chart of preservation file formats for audio and video. You can see that for audio and video, preservation format and access formats are pretty different. For audio, you want to preserve your files in a WAV format, but you can copy and create access formats in MP3s. Access formats are usually smaller in size than preservation formats. And another note, any editing of files should always be done in an access copy. The preservation copy, once you make it, that's it. You generally shouldn't touch that unless you're making another access copy. Active preservation is necessary for good file maintenance. So again, always back up your files and save them in different locations. Check your files every year. You can pick a date and make it an annual occasion. Maybe you want to spend your birthday doing this kind of work, but basically you schedule time to open your files and make sure you can hear the audio and hear and see the video. It's recommended that every 5 years or whenever there's a software update, you save your files to the newest version of that software. And if you are no longer actively using that file and haven't yet saved it in a preservation format, you should do that as soon as you can. And finally, remember the 2-2-2 rule, 2 copies in 2 different formats if possible, and 2 different storage locations, again, like one in the cloud and one somewhere considered local, like a hard drive. So hopefully these tips will get you ready to start thinking about who to interview and get started with your projects and have fun with it. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for your fantastic presentation. So yes, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type anything into the questions panel. We'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. So Teddy asks, if I use my iPhone camera to record a video, do you know how long that video can be? Are there limits? Does it depend on the phone, the storage? And then are there problems with maybe uploading to a computer if it is too long of a or too big of a file?
You know, I don't know the specifics of file limitations or how long a video can be on your iPhone, but I'm sure that information should be fairly easy to find online. You know, it probably ultimately depends on how much storage you have on your phone because it will be saved automatically to your phone. And if you don't have a lot of storage space on your phone, that's going to be your most immediate problem. So that's what I would sort of be concerned about first and foremost is how much storage do you have on your phone. But I don't know how long those videos can be.
Okay, great. So it looks like something to just check online, and certainly
Yeah.
your local storage is kind of the most immediate issue.
Yeah, I would say, sorry, Jennifer, I would say if you're just doing sort of like you're with your relative or you just sort of think of a quick question you want to ask and record it and it's just 1 or 2 questions, I think that's probably perfectly fine to record on your phone without any major issues. As long as it's a short recording, it should be okay.
No, Bonnie asks, do you need to kind of first publish the interview in order to cite it in a published family history?
I don't think so, but that would be, I mean, if it's just a family history that you're sort of working on, or if it's an article or another publication and you're working with a publisher, they would give you more information on that. But I think you can certainly cite it as, you know, this is an interview that was conducted with person A by person B on this date. And if it's sort of in a private collection, you can just acknowledge that it's privately owned as opposed to at an archival repository somewhere.
All right, and Joanne asks about what about, and I know this is one of your favorite topics, what about changing technologies? For example, in my lifetime, we've gone from audio cassette recorders to digital, you know, who knows what will be next? Kind of how do you handle that, especially if you have interviews on now kind of defunct or maybe archaic technology and formats?
Great question. It is one of my favorite topics. So obsolete media is definitely a problem. It's a problem for archives and it's a problem for people that have things stored on obsolete media. Thankfully, there are businesses out there that love your business and would be happy to migrate that for you, obviously for a fee. But usually they're pretty reasonable and they can actually, you know, take your obsolete media and migrate it onto a newer format. And then what it means for you once you have it migrated onto a newer format is just stay on top of it and make sure that if there is, you know, another sort of technology switch and your newer format is now obsolete, you can transfer it to something that is more current.
Now, Gary asks, what are some ways to get, you know, kind of distant relatives, maybe folks that you've never met in person, you know, new relatives that you're discovering? How do you kind of get their attention and response when you kind of sense that they really have no interest in knowing you or might be suspicious of your motives or really don't have any interest in family history? I mean, do you have any suggestions on how to kind of engage a potential narrator in someone that you really don't know?
Yeah, and I guess this would be also if you don't have anyone sort of in common who's willing to basically be that intermediary for you. I would say give them a call, send them an email. I think emails are a little less threatening to people, quite frankly. And they might be more comfortable receiving an email and just sort of putting it all out there, who you are and how you think you're related or how you are related. And maybe just give them some ideas of what you're looking to talk about, and acknowledge that they don't know you and this is their time that you are asking for, but you would, just they're doing you a favor, so you would just want to be really grateful for whatever time they could possibly give you. And I think sometimes in people's responses, you can sort of read if maybe they're not open to it right now, but they might be in the future. But if they definitely are, not interested, I would say you're going to have to put it aside, because I think that if somebody is really just not keen to talk to you about something, they're not going to necessarily change their mind no matter what you say or do.
And you talked a bit about potentially donating an interview to an archives or another repository. If you have an interview with folks who are deceased, and so you don't have maybe that full consent form, are there issues or ethical issues that you should be concerned about and perhaps not, and that would prevent you from donating that interview?
So I'm going to say this mostly depends on the archive in question. An archive that has a really good oral history program in place, meaning they have a history of collecting oral history interviews, will have probably a much better answer for you of what they would do and what they're comfortable with. For us at the Jewish Heritage Center, we don't have a policy about that. And so we are a little more hesitant to do anything with oral history interviews of someone who's deceased that we don't have any sign-offs on. That being said, with time, privacy concerns do tend to be alleviated. So you could certainly donate it to an archive and just ask that it be restricted for 25 years, or 10 years or 15 years, depending on when the interview took place. And that might be enough to put the archive at ease, and also any family members that might be concerned about the content of that interview might feel better about that too.
All right. And Susan also asks, can obsolete media players be donated to archives or libraries? Is that something that archives and libraries are interested in?
Potentially. It depends on what's in their collections and if they have a need for it. But I do know certainly sometimes a researcher might come in and they need to listen to something and the archive has no way of playing it for them. So that is absolutely a possibility. And, I would say feel free to reach out to an archive if you have something and offer it to them.
All right. Well, it looks like those are just about all the questions. So thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. Thank you again, Stephanie. So if we didn't get to your question, or maybe you have more specific questions about your family history research, you may consider scheduling a consultation or hiring our research services team. You can learn more about those services by going to the email addresses or writing to the email addresses that you see on your screen. And we also have recently expanded our free online chat service. So this is free, open to the public, available at americanancestors.org/chat. So if you want to talk to a genealogist, maybe you have a reference question, or you can't find something on our website, that kind of thing, you can use this service Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And I will be including all of this email in my, as well as a link to the recording in my follow-up email to you later today. And as the holidays are right around the corner, next week, in fact, and beyond, you can give the gift of family history while receiving a gift for yourself. If you purchase a 3-month gift membership to American Ancestors, you receive a $5 gift certificate to our online bookstore, or if you purchase a full year gift membership, you would receive a $10 gift certificate. And that offer expires December 31st. And you can learn more by going to AmericanAncestors.org. So thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and for others. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.